It's been nearly a decade since the Brexit referendum, and let's be honest, it's been a mess. Economically, socially, politically, things have only gotten worse. And those grand promises of a better, freer, more successful Britain, I think people have given up looking for them. And for many on the left, this collapse is seen as proof that Brexit was this historic mistake, and there is continual calls to reverse course, rejoin the EU, and try to get things back to how they were before. Now, back in 2016, when the referendum was happening, I was 18. I voted to Remain, like all of my friends, and like a lot of people, I just blindly assumed that Remain would win quite easily. Looking back, I didn't really interrogate my views. Being pro-EU just felt like the progressive stance, something you absorb culturally, not understand necessarily politically. It was an easy choice, especially when you see the right-wing figures who were leading the Leave campaign. But apart from freedom of movement, I couldn't really have properly explained what the EU actually did for ordinary people. But now we've gotten older, hopefully wiser, but definitely more disillusioned with the status quo, I've started asking myself a pretty uncomfortable question. Was the EU ever really serving the people who needed it the most? The working class, the poor, those shut out of political power? And crucially, was it ever even meant to? The dominant story of Brexit is that working class voters were duped, or worse, driven by this innate bigotry for other people. While again this seems logical given the charlatans and demagogues who championed the Leave campaign, I also do partly think it is just a comfortable narrative for pro-EU Remainers to tell themselves. It means people don't have to confront the reality of the society we are living in. And what if these voters weren't all that irrational? What if they were simply responding to years of decline and saw no reason to believe that the status quo was ever going to deliver them that change they needed? If you decide the problem was simply bad voters, then you never have to reckon with why so many people felt the status quo wasn't working for them in the first place. There's always been a quieter, often ignored socialist critique of the EU. Not from a place of nationalism, but one from concern about inequality, true democracy, and rules that consistently favour markets over workers. But that critique has been kept quiet for years. Maybe because nobody on the left wanted to look like they were siding with the right-wing Brexiteers, or they didn't want to risk alienating their largely pro-EU base. But I do think this critique deserves more attention now, because if our problems do run a lot deeper than Brexit, then would rejoining the EU change anything at all? To understand this argument, we have to understand what the EU fundamentally is. We have to look at what it was built for in the first place. Now, after World War II, Europe was devastated. The priority was simple: prevent another war between France and Germany on the continent. And the way to do that wasn't through shared culture or democracy. It was through combining economies. So in 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community was created, placing coal and steel production under joint oversight so no nation could rearm without the others knowing. Then in 1957 came the Treaties of Rome, establishing the European Economic Community, a common market for trading of commodities. Now, in the 1980s, the Single European Act accelerated full market liberalisation. Then came the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, which formalised an entire economic model. And this is where the rules that still shape Europe today were written into law. I think this origin matters, because the EU's foundations were built around markets long before social protections came into the picture. And you can see the priorities clearly in the treaty articles themselves. We have Article 107, which is about state aid, and part of it restricts how far governments can support national industries. The logic is that it prevents distortion of market competition and protects big corporations across the continent. Article 121, budget surveillance. This creates EU oversight of national budgets. It pushes governments towards discipline even during economic downturn. Then we have Article 126, excessive deficits. This article sets strict deficit limits, allowing sanctions or corrective measures. We'll come on to that later. And then Article 63, we have free movement of capital. This protects cross-border investment flows and stops countries from restricting capital flight. And finally, we have Article 151. This one often surprises people. It explicitly says that social policy must operate within the overall economic objectives of the EU. In other words, social and labour rights are allowed as long as they don't interfere with economic freedoms. That hierarchy, markets first, social goals second, is still there today. Now, to be fair, the EU did add stronger social protections later on. But if social or democratic decisions clash with competition law, state aid rules, budget constraints, or the free movement of capital, then the economic rules take priority. That's not an opinion, that's literally what's written into the treaties. Now, none of this means the EU is inherently evil. It just means it has a very specific structure. Economic integration is compulsory. Social protection is conditional, and democratic choices are acceptable unless they interfere with the market. This is why left-wing governments inside the EU often find themselves blocked from implementing the policies they're elected to deliver. It's not because voters don't want change, it's not because the ideas are too radical, but it's because the treaties define the boundaries of what's allowed. And unless those treaties change, which requires unanimous agreement from 27 countries, that hierarchy stays in place. So I think if you're on the left, it is important to question to yourself what the EU actually is. And from my research, my opinion now is it's just another neoliberal institution, a more polished technocratic version of capitalism, with just enough protections to stop the worst of abuses and the worst failures of capitalism, but never enough to challenge the underlying economic system that we're in. And I think that's why politicians like Blair, Cameron, Clegg, they all adored the EU, because the EU fits perfectly with their worldview. Free markets, free capital, lighter touch regulation, and a social floor that never threatens the economic border above it. Because they don't like when capitalism goes completely wrong, because people start to question it. And if you want to understand how hard it is to pursue a different kind of economic system inside the EU, all we have to do is look at what happened to Greece post-2008 and into the 2010s. So, 2008 affected every country, but Greece was particularly hard done by. Years of low growth, high debt, and a weak tax base made this country extremely vulnerable. So when the financial crisis hit, it almost collapsed the economy overnight. The story we were told and what we hear about is that Greece had to be rescued by the EU. But the bailouts the EU offered weren't designed to rescue Greek people. They were designed to rescue European banks, mainly in Germany and France. And we all know that these bankers had lent recklessly for years preceding 2008. But instead of the EU supporting Greece in a recovery and thinking of the working class, Greece was forced into very tough austerity measures. Hospitals were stripped back, schools were completely underfunded, pensions were cut again and again and again. Unemployment was soaring, nearly all of Greece's public assets were sold off. And none of this was chosen by Greek voters. They didn't have a choice in it. It was enforced by the European Commission, the ECB, and the IMF. The Troika. By 2015, Greece and its people had reached breaking point. So, in the elections, Greek people elected the Syriza party, a left-wing party with a clear mandate to end the most damaging austerity. And the Syriza party didn't come to Brussels with a radical Marxist plan. Their proposals were very modest, mainstream, and economically reasonable. They were far from a socialist revolution. They were simply a logical attempt at how best to rebuild a collapsing society. But here was the problem. If Greece was allowed to break from austerity the EU had imposed, others who had been hit by sanctions would have to follow. Spain, Portugal, Italy, all of them had to suffer under the same rules previously. All had public unrest and anti-austerity movements waiting for a spark. If one country proved you could renegotiate debt, rebuild public services, then almost the entire Eurozone model, built on strict discipline and no flexibility, would come undone. So Greece had to be made an example of. So when Syriza tried to negotiate, the ECB shut down Greek banks. A modern European country had its financial system completely frozen. And it wasn't just because it was reckless economically, but it was more because it challenged the entire logic underlying the Eurozone. And in the end, the EU won. Syriza was forced to sign an even harsher deal, not because the Greek people rejected their plan, but because the European economy said they had to. And I think that's an important lesson. Even if democratically elected governments are elected by their people and they vote for a specific economic change, well, if it goes against what the EU mandates, then you can't have it. You have to stick to their economics. And if that's true for Greece, a whole nation with a clear democratic mandate, then we have to ask, how much room is there for genuinely transformative politics inside the EU at all? Now, as I've already said, Brexit was a disaster. It is a disaster. But that doesn't automatically mean that the EU would have saved us or if anything would have been different. A lot of the time, people want black and white answers. They don't want to hold two things up together and say both could be true. Yes, the Brexit we got was driven by right-wing free marketeers who wanted fewer protections, less accountability, and more space for crony capitalism. But fundamentally, I think it's true that many of the problems we now blame on Brexit were already happening before we left. It was already in motion. And I know that because if you look at countries that are still in the EU, with similar economies to us, they're having the same issues. Look at France, mass strikes, broken services, a far-right party nearly on the brink of power. Germany is the same, starting to have economic stagnation. Italy's already gone to a right-wing government. Across the continent, far-right movements are exploding. Public trust is collapsing. Inequality is deepening. Living standards are being squeezed everywhere. It's not just in the UK. These aren't isolated national failures. They're symptoms of a wider system that's prioritised markets over people for decades. So when you say that the UK's decline is purely because of Brexit, it's worth asking yourself, if the EU is the cure, why are so many EU member states facing the exact same crisis? So no, I'm not defending the Brexit we got. It was terrible. It was handled appallingly. I'm just saying I'm not convinced staying in the EU would have protected us from this crisis at all. Because this crisis isn't British. It's not unique to the UK. It's global. We might have declined a bit faster, but everyone's heading in the same direction anyway. The idea that the EU can be reformed to this vehicle for deep democratic socialism is increasingly delusional because power is concentrated in unelected bodies. Just go and look at Eurogroup. And the economic rules are locked into its articles. These were made in its formation. The EU is not designed to serve people. It's designed to serve markets, and it defends that with legal force. The EU might have been better than what we have now, but better than the status quo isn't exactly how we end up setting up systems built for the future. It's not about picking the best of two rubbish choices. It's about building a system or systems that work for everyone. We shouldn't be comparing just Britain to the EU. We should be comparing both to the kind of society we actually want. And I'm not saying international cooperation is a bad idea. In fact, I think the opposite. It's essential. On climate, on migration, on global inequality. But the EU has turned internationalism into liberal supranationalism. It's built to protect capital, enforce competition, and limit how much democracy can interfere with market forces. So if we keep seeing Brexit as the defining political trauma of our time, we risk being stuck in a loop that goes on and on and on, thinking about the past and just going around the same systems that keep failing people in the present. So I want to build a different kind of future, one that's not based on elite consensus or capitalist markets, but on genuine democratic control, social ownership, and systems that put people first. We do need internationalism, but we also need realism. If we want real change, we have to start building something else, something better.